Hello and welcome to another Frontline recap. I'm Philip Ingram. Now, as you can see, we're on our own channel. So please like, subscribe, pass it around. We haven't got our membership set up yet. The technical guys are onto it from what I've been told, but we do pick up your comments and everything else. Of course, I'm Philip Ingram. I am a former senior British military intelligence officer and I commentate globally on all matters defence, security, cyber, terrorism and anything else. But more importantly for you, I present Frontline as well. So I'm going to point you at a couple of things that set the flavour for what's been happening this week before I get into a couple of the interviews that have gone on. As ever, I commend all of our long-form interviews to you because Ukraine seems to be slipping off the headlines, and this will give you a good understanding of what is really going on, and there's an awful lot still happening. The first little clip I want to point you at is President Zelensky giving a statement, and have a look at this here.
As for the elections, an intention to announce them on the 24th of February, this is the first I've heard of it. I probably heard it for the first time from the Financial Times. We will proceed with the elections when all the necessary security guarantees are in place. Thirdly, I've always said that the issue of elections is raised by Ukraine's partners. Ukraine itself has never raised it, but we are certainly ready for elections. I've said that it is very simple to achieve this. Establish a ceasefire and there will be elections. In other words, it's a matter of security. But if we raise the issue of a referendum, as I have already said, there should be an understanding that there will be a ceasefire for this, because a referendum is structured like an election. That is, security is needed. I cannot go to Moscow for negotiations with Putin, the capital of the country that is the aggressor in this war. We are ready to support the proposals of the United States of America to meet in any territory of America, Europe, neutral countries, any state except the Russian Federation and Belarus. In my opinion, both America and Europe should work together, solely with Ukraine, because it is our issues that are being raised. And fighting Russia alone, with America communicating separately with Russia and Europe communicating separately, I believe that only Russia will benefit from this. Together, America and Europe are definitely stronger. Do I think this war can end? Look, it depends not only on Ukraine but also on America, which must pressure Russia. Sorry for saying must, but there is no other way. It must put pressure on Russia if there is a desire not only on the Ukrainian side but also on the part of the aggressor. Then we will be able to end the hostilities by summer. Today I had a conversation with Emmanuel Macron. We discussed the details of our meetings in Abu Dhabi with the Russians, as well as with the American side. He briefed me on his advisor, Emmanuel Bon's meeting in Russia.
And this is where Zelensky says there's no plan for elections or referenda until a ceasefire. And this is putting into context something that had come out in social media to say that President Zelensky was looking for a way to get round the Ukrainian constitution, which bans elections during martial law. So that he could go to Donald Trump and say, we're getting an election out. It was mooted that it would happen on the 24th of February. That is a very tight timeline. But Zelensky has come out, or President Zelensky has come out and clarified that that's not going to happen and tied a lot of it into security guarantees, which again haven't been properly defined and everything else. So elections, he can say he's got plans in place for those to Donald Trump. It was a condition that Donald Trump was trying to force onto him. The Ukrainian constitution still doesn't allow elections to happen while martial law is happening. It would be a real challenge for that to go on. But it's Zelensky showing cooperation and the desire to move forward and not put any blocks in place to peace. So the next clip I want to point you at is from the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. Let's have a look at this here.
Besides that they made a proposal regarding Ukraine, and we were ready to accept it, and now they are not. We do not see any bright future in the economic sphere either. The Americans want to take control of all the routes for providing the world's leading countries and all continents with energy resources, while remaining open, just like India, China, Indonesia and Brazil, to cooperation with all countries, including a major power such as the United States. We are in a situation where the Americans themselves are creating artificial obstacles along this path. We are simply forced to seek additional protected ways to develop our financial, economic, logistical and other projects with the BRICS countries. We are told that the Ukraine problem should be resolved. In Anchorage, we accepted the US proposal. If we approach it like a man, it means that they proposed it and we agreed. So the problem must be resolved. President Putin has said on many occasions that it is not important for Russia what Ukraine and Europe are going to say. We can clearly see the primitive Russophobia of most regimes in the European Union, with rare exceptions. The US position was important to us.
And this is where Lavrov, interestingly, is starting to turn on the United States in a way that he's saying there's no bright economic future for working with the United States. And he goes on to argue that Russia now needs to increase its relationship with BRICS. And BRICS is an economic power bloc that was set up to try and rival not just the EU but the US dominance, US dollar dominance across the world. But Lavrov coming out with statements that the United States and Donald Trump may take as something of a bit of a threat, especially when it comes to economic issues. That's not going to go down well in Washington. So we haven't had Washington's response to this yet. We've got the Munich Security Conference starting tomorrow. So let's see what the US response to that is after the NATO conference today with NATO foreign ministers. Let's see if anything comes out of that. But could this be a sea change where the Russians are suddenly recognizing that the United States is not their friend? And could this change the tide of things? Too early to tell. 3 interviews I want to point you out this week very quickly. First one is with an old friend of the show, Scott Lucas, Professor Scott Lucas, and he's discussing exactly what Sergei Lavrov said in his comments there and saying that the US is going back on its promises made in Alaska. Have a little look at this here.
Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, this morning, because he threw a bit of a tantrum. Old Sergei gets out there, and far from saying we're closing in on a deal, he says the Trump administration is retreating on us. They're stepping out on what we agreed. Now let's decode that coming out of the trilateral talks. Lavrov and the Kremlin keep referring back to Anchorage. That is back in August 2025 when Putin gets to Trump face to face and he's going to try to manipulate him. What's he going to try to manipulate him with? The idea is Russians get all of Donetsk, no security guarantees for Ukraine. Well, why should America buy into that? Because Russia is going to tell the Americans, and we're going to get all these joint economic projects. Everybody's going to win-win. You're a businessman, Mr. Trump. We're business people. We're all going to get rich together. So the Russians, as we go through this 2 set of trilateral talks, are continuing to try to manipulate Trump and his envoys, son-in-law Jared Kushner, real estate developer Steve Witkoff, with the idea of, look at all these economic projects. Zelensky calls them out a few days ago and says, we understand that Russia is trying to discuss $12 trillion, that's with a T, $12 trillion of economic projects with the U.S. Rare earth minerals, you can assume, is going to be part of that. Other investment, other manufacturing deals. Lavrov comes out today, and the indication here is the Americans did not honor what they said in Alaska. In other words, the Russians have not gotten in advance on those economic projects as the lever to get what they want out of the negotiations. So, if Lavrov's in a bad mood, it don't bode well for the Kremlin actually wanting to move forward on this. And it's important to note that although Ukraine said, all right, the next set of talks could be in the United States, and they dangled it out there, absolutely no indication from Russia about a third set of talks going forward. So no, we shift back to where we are, which is Russian missile and drone strikes on a nightly basis. They hit Kharkiv and Odessa and Kyiv overnight, killed at least 3 people, hit a bit of energy infrastructure. Meanwhile, they keep trying to make some type of gradual advance on the front lines. Broad framework, Louis, it's not the talks we're talking about here. It's how much of a window Russia has for that type of military assault on the air and on the ground. That determines what happens next. Putin's biggest hope right now is that he gets Donetsk and he gets a weakened Ukraine through negotiations, or rather capitulation. So we bring it back around to the talks, which is the Kremlin's aim here is they thought they had the Americans in their pocket in late October because Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, real estate developer Steve Witkoff, worked with Kirill Dmitriev, Vladimir Putin's top economic advisor, on that 28-point ultimatum. They thought they had it, but Ukraine and Russia pushed back to the point where the U.S. had joined security guarantees for Ukraine. Whether or not they fulfill them, we'll see. But they've joined that, and Russia still doesn't have a guarantee they get Donetsk. That's why Lavrov was so grumpy today. That their play here is to get Ukraine's capitulation at the table because they cannot get it now on the front line. And unless there's a breakthrough, an unexpected breakthrough on that front line, that's the position they're going to be facing going into the spring and summer.
And Scott then goes on to talk about the sanctions that have come in against Lukoil and Rosenfeld are unfair. And these are the additional sanctions that have been put on against oil and gas. What's clear from the whole interview, and Scott's got a good understanding of this, is the real pressure that these sanctions are putting on Russia's ability to continue to fund this war. And that is something that Putin, I think, is beginning to get concerned about. We're not at the point of Russian economic collapse yet, but there are little shoots, green shoots of woes coming to the Russian people and coming to the Russian economy. Most of the Russian rainy day funds have been expended in supporting the war in one way or the other. Many Russian industries can't afford to pay their workforces. In the Russian newspapers this week, it was saying that an increasing number of Russian industries feel that they're in recession themselves, and it's beginning to hit out, as I've mentioned in the Q&A. Go and watch that. That is beginning to hit out at the local Russian people, with the Russian newspapers focusing on cucumber prices this week, a 425% increase. We had eggs a few weeks ago. Cucumbers are this week. We'll have to see what's next week. But it's getting the impact of the war in the heads and minds and the day-to-day lives of the average Russian person. That's what Putin fears most. So next interview is with another old friend of the show, Bill Browder, and what Bill doesn't know about the economic impact on Russia and Russian economics and Putin politically isn't worth knowing. Have a look at this here.
If he sits down with Zelensky and Trump, then it becomes obvious who the person is who doesn't want peace, and that's Vladimir Putin. Zelensky said, "I want peace. I'm ready for peace. Stop bombing us. Peace means you quit your invasion." And he's ready to negotiate on various terms, which are unbelievably generous to the Russians, just to stop the murder of his citizens. There are certain red lines. He doesn't want to give up territory that hasn't already been conquered by the Russians. I think that's reasonable. He wants security guarantees to say that if the Russians stop where they are, that they can't go on in the future. I think that's also reasonable. But if they were actually in a room and he were to say that's my condition, Putin would say, no, I want everything. And at that point, it becomes obvious that Putin is the guy holding back peace. And then Trump looks particularly bad if he doesn't do something to Putin, which he doesn't want to do. And so the easy way to avoid that is just not to go into that room and not to have that meeting.
As part of those comments that Lavrov said, he really did seem to voice an upset or even surprise with the US, alluding back to the Alaska talks that went on between Trump and Putin, and seemingly implying that America wasn't holding up its side of a deal made there. Do you think the Russians are getting quite frustrated that America haven't just given them everything they wanted, as they keep asking for?
Well, I mean, I think that if you look at the whole scenario, Russia has gotten a total free pass. There were so many different opportunities for Putin to agree a ceasefire, to stop his offensive, to come to the negotiating table, and at every single one of these opportunities, Putin has thumbed his nose at the process, at the Ukrainians, and most importantly, at the Americans. And so for them to be frustrated that there's been some small sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft, which, by the way, aren't being fully enforced, is really kind of disingenuous. But for what it's worth, it doesn't really matter what Lavrov says. I mean, Lavrov is not a principal here. He's said a few very anti-American things, and he was then for a while we didn't see him. He didn't fall out of any windows or succumb to any poison, but he kind of disappeared into the woodwork for a while, and then he comes out again and says something. And it could easily be good cop, bad cop. I don't know exactly what the strategy is here, but I can pretty much guarantee you that Putin is not going to start a new hostile situation with America, because he's gotten such a great deal so far that he should really be very pleased with himself. And whatever Lavrov says is he's either done unauthorized or he's doing it as just a counterpoint to the warm communications that Putin probably has privately with President Trump and with Steve Witkoff.
And it seems like the US and Russia could be on a bit of a collision course here. We've heard some angry language out of Lavrov for the US over the last couple of days, accusing America of what they call unfair sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft. He says he sees no bright future economically with Washington. Do you think that honeymoon period that we alluded to before with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner and elements of the Kremlin might be coming to an end?
No, I think that President Trump will ignore that. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner will ignore that. They'll carry on with their facade of a peace negotiation, and there will not be any harsher punishments on Russia than there already are.
And Starlink has banned Russian soldiers and troops in Ukraine from using its systems. That appears to have halted or slowed some Russian offensives that are going on in Ukraine. Were you surprised to see that move from Elon Musk? Because he's been very back and forth on Ukraine and his thoughts on supporting that country.
Well, I think that's actually been one of the most positive things that's happened in the last few days, because that prevents Ukrainian deaths. And I don't know why Starlink allowed Russia to use their systems before. I'm glad that Elon Musk took this decision. It's impossible to know his thought process, but thank God they can't use it, because it's completely screwed up their communications. It's made it very difficult for them to target Ukrainian positions, and less people have died as a result of that. And so if there's been one good thing that's happened in the last few days, it's been that.
Bill goes on to talk about why Putin doesn't want to sit down with Zelensky and Trump, because Putin effectively is concerned that he will get called out. He will get found out by sitting in front of them. He doesn't want to turn around to Trump to his face and say no to what Zelensky's proposing. And if you look at all the peace negotiations so far, Zelensky has given so many concessions. He has moved on so many different issues, and Putin hasn't moved on one. In fact, Vladimir Putin has added additional requirements in. The biggest one that is said the whole way through is Putin wanting the areas of the Donbass that he hasn't captured yet. And he's trying to tie any negotiations into that. British Defence Intelligence has suggested it'll take at least another 4 years and 2 million casualties to capture that. This is the defensive belt that Ukraine has built, and if the Russians got through that, it would be a relatively straightforward ambition for them to militarily get to Kyiv again. So they can't afford to give up this defensive or this fortress belt that's there. And Bill explains that well. Don't just listen to the clip. Go and listen to the long-form interview with Scott and Bill. They're both good. And the other long-form interview that's worth listening to is our next one. And this is me sitting down with George Barros from the Institute of the Study of War. Have a listen to this here.
The Russian Telegram bloggers and military sources have for months, and in fact for years, but in this particular sector in Zaporizhia for months, have been lying about their performance. They've been embellishing their performance. They've been putting forward maps of the purported front line that are much further ahead of what ISW assesses, what other organizations assesses, what the available combat footage and visual evidence can suggest. And now what seems to be happening is we're having a retroactive Russian correction. And so the Russian maps at this stage have gotten about 15, 20 kilometers, give or take, ahead of reality. And now, to save face, the Russians are actually let's call it adjusting their assessment by retrograding their lines back. And what they're claiming is that there's a counterattack. The Ukrainians are attacking us, or they penetrate our lines, that sort of thing. Here's what the new line is looking like. I'm sure you've seen that map with the red and the blue ink and that sort of thing. And what's very interesting is that if you actually compare the battlefield geometry of those new lines from the supposed Ukrainian counteroffensive, it actually lines up pretty closely with where the lines have more or less statically been for the past several weeks, actually. And so this seems to be more of how the Russians are deciding to solve their problem of having overconfidently stated what the front line is, and now they're correcting it.
Overconfidently is a good word, but there are financial incentives and medal incentives and other things for the Russian commanders to say that they're getting further ahead, which is why we see them running forward, putting a little flag up, taking a photograph, and geolocating it, sending it back. Surely with this sort of correction, there's going to be penalties that'll come in. Are we expecting some Russian commanders to take up window cleaning and fall out of ninth floor windows?
I think at this tactical level, probably not, because these sort of tactical blunders don't make it very high up the chain. I think these are sort of going to be like company, platoon, maybe regimental or brigade level issues at absolute highest. But this is tactical stuff. We're talking about 5 or tens of kilometers in rural fields that are not decisive for current operations, and neither the main Russian area of responsibility. The kinds of failures that do actually result with problems and generals getting demoted or falling out of windows and such are major operational failures. I mean, things like the loss of Kupiansk, the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv in 2022, or commanders who receive and build such a terrible reputation over a long protracted time. There have been, for example, regimental and brigade commanders who become infamous for just simply sending droves and droves of men to their deaths, or really blundering quite badly tactical scenarios. There was a failed river crossing in Luhansk or Donetsk back in 2022, for example, in Bielorivka, where a battalion's worth of tanks and armored personnel carriers were destroyed in a botched river crossing. And so I think the commander who was in charge of that got into trouble because of that. So, but this sort of thing, I think they'll probably it'll be swept under the rug.
Well, yes, they didn't get Vladimir Putin to turn around and say it was a big success and all the rest of it, and then Zelensky go and get a photograph in front of some symbol that suggested that was wrong. But at the same time, we've got that was Russian Telegram claims. We're getting the Ukrainian Minister of Defense are turning around and saying that the Russians are concentrating up to 100,000 troops. They're getting armored capability together. They are preparing for some form of large offensive, and we're assuming, come spring, come summer, a standard spring-summer offensive. We've seen this report come in every year so far, and yes, the Russians have tried something, but it's always petered out. What are you seeing? Are the Ukrainians, and why do you think the Ukrainians are once again banging that drum of the Russians are coming? Help!
Yeah, well, this is going to go close to the bounds of what we can see with open source. It's notoriously difficult to be able to track forces, especially once they're already in the theater and not using logistics like trains and stuff and such around. So my situational awareness of here is going to be slightly degraded, but the Ukrainians have better intelligence than what I have. And we know that the Ukrainians do track the Russian force groupings pretty well within Ukraine. There's, of course, allied American and NATO intelligence sharing with Ukraine. And so whenever they talked about these large force groupings, they've always been substantiated. I mean, it's because there are efforts, they do build operational reserves, they do prepare to commit forces. And I think what we're seeing now is the Russian preparations for the anticipated spring offensive. We are in a low tempo time. The tempo since January has been degraded because the weather's been poor. It's brutal cold, and of course, as you know, those Russian soldiers that do the infiltration missions, they're doing that with just the pack on their back and not a whole lot else, and so it's very hard to do that sort of war fighting. And I do anticipate that we will see an intensified push or series of pushes in the next several weeks or months, probably in March, certainly by April. I would expect us to see a new push. So They're preparing. It'll be interesting to see how the Russian command weights which sectors of the front are going to be the priority sectors, which ones are going to be more opportunistic. Our current assessment, based off of the arrayment of which formations are where and where the better units are, is that the Russians are going to continue prioritizing Donetsk Oblast, particularly the Konstantinovka fight, and perhaps even in Liman to try to get to the northern, the left bank of the Siversky Donetsk River, so they can attack the fortress belt from the northern direction as well. That seems to be the priority effort right now, but we're of course always collecting more data and always adjusting our assessments based off of where they put the best units.
And in this clip, this is George talking about the Zaporizhia front, and we've had a lot of reports of the Russians having some success in the Zaporizhia front, but the Ukrainians saying that, or the Russians saying that the Ukrainians have penetrated the front by 18 kilometers. George turns around and says, the Ukrainians haven't done that, or nothing that they've seen suggests they've done that. What this seems to be is the Russians had over-exaggerated how much territory they've taken, and they're now trying to roll back on that and say that the Ukrainians have counterattacked in and they've moved forward. This is an internal reporting reset in the Russian side of things, as George says. But we're going to discuss Ukrainian command and control in the long-form interview and various other very, very interesting subjects. What George and his team don't know about what's going on tactically on the ground on a day-to-day basis isn't worth knowing. And George has just got back from Ukraine, so his insights from that are fascinating. So go and watch the whole interview. But that's all I have from Recap this week. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, put your comments in for me to answer in the Q&A, and pass it around your friends as well. And please bear with us. We're on our own channel now. That's because you've made this such a success, and thank you for that. And thank you for listening. Goodbye.